I'd like to read an essay from Charles Simic's Essays and Memoirs, The Unemployed Fortune Teller. This is called Poetry is the Present, and it was delivered as a lecture at a conference on Octavio Paz and published in Western Humanities Review in 1991. Poetry is the Present. Throughout his life, Octavio Paz has remained free, tempted by neither the ideological utopias nor the nostalgia that has proliferated and imprisoned so many of his contemporaries. Someone, I forgot who, said that it takes a heroic constitution to endure our modern age. Paz is one of our true heroes. In times of the celebrated incommunicability of just about everything, he has thought and written with clarity. He has understood what he knows, which again makes him unusual. I would characterize his thinking as the most sustained, the most eloquent defense of poetry that we have. Does poetry need to be defended? Of course, always, and especially today. Last night, Octavio Paz told us, poetry is the present. I couldn't agree more. This is poetry's most outrageous idea, and it has a long and interesting history of which I wish to speak briefly. We are not sure who was first, Sappho or some forgotten contemporary of hers, but in the 7th century BC we hear something new in poetry, a voice and solitude for which the present moment is everything. The moon and Pleiades are set, the night is half gone, and time speeds by. I lie in bed, alone. Before that, of course, there was the epic, with its clashing swords, its stories of gods and heroes, and many other kinds of poems, but nothing that sounds quite like Sappho. In another poem she says, I remember Anactoria, who is gone from me, and whose lovely walk and the shining pallor of her face I would rather see before my eyes than Lydia's chariots and all their glory armored for battle. All of a sudden, instead of the stories of gods and heroes, we get the lives of poets. In other words, not what Zeus and Achilles did, but what some woman on an island off Asia Minor felt on a particular night when she couldn't sleep. Her voice, her life, her timeless moment resonate through the centuries. The lyric poem represents a great change in the history of consciousness and the history of literature. Olga Friedenberg observed that it marks a shift from a mythological to a realistic view of the world. It is in lyric poetry that the literary universe is inhabited for the first time by individuals. There were always lyric poems, folk songs sung by women, but their speaker was anonymous. Sappho inserts the first-person pronoun, makes the experience of the folk song personal. It is women who invented the lyric poem. The philosophers and theologians were scandalized. The early Christian church burned the writings of Sappho with fanatical thoroughness. Today only fragments of her poems are left. About her life we know next to nothing. Some ancient authors say she was a priestess. Some say a prostitute. It's curious that in our century the same words occur in the condemnation of the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova. Stalin's cultural czar, Andrei Zadanov, said, "Here's a little bourgeois lady, half nun, half whore." He said that her intensely personal poems with their mixture of eroticism and mysticism were foreign to the spirit of the Soviet people who were building socialism. O consciousness, pure, present, where past and future burn with neither brilliance nor hope, everything leads into this eternity which leads nowhere, writes Paz in a poem. Poetry is the moment, the experience of the naked moment. It's not so much that all ages are contemporaneous, as Ezra Pound claimed, but that all present moments in literature are. There's more to this than that, however. The proposition that poetry is the present has philosophical ambitions which the ancient philosophers and theologians already suspected, and the 20th century Marxists severely punished. This is what lyric poets are saying. While philosophy and theology ask what being is, poetry gives us the experience of being. The poets, so we believe, remind the philosophers again and again of the world's baffling presence. Unfortunately, not many contemporary philosophers and literary critics believe any of this. As Hayden Carruth once told me, we poets of the second half of the 20th century are really displaced metaphysicians of the 19th century. People still living in the regions of thought that the philosophers have fled out of bafflement and despair and false modesty. He's right, of course. As far as some people are concerned, poetry is just whistling in the dark. There's no presence, says our distinguished critic, Jeffrey Hartman. There's only representation, and worse, representations. There's nothing outside the text, says Jacques Derrida. Poets, they claim, share in the bourgeois notion that signs are transparent, that they point to an authentic reality. A seductive temptation to mystified minds, Paul de Man assures us. The truth value of poetry, therefore, is zero. All the poet's images and metaphors merely point back to language itself, we are told triumphantly. Plato imprisoned us in a cave to demonstrate our ignorance and the terror of our situation, but in today's prison house of language, our philosophers are happy. Language is not the only prison. We are incarcerated, so they say, in prisons of class, race, gender, culture, and so on. Today's intellectual landscape is that of prisons, maximum security penitentiaries, and philosophical gulags. Such notions sound plausible if we forget many things about literature, and especially if we forget translation. How is it that we find ancient Greek poetry moving if there are no universal experiences? As my friend Mark Strand and I realized years ago, poetry is not what is lost, but what is retained in translation. I agree with Paz that it is impossible to be a poet without believing in the identity of the word and what it means. There's that something beyond language on which every poem depends for its existence. The complaint that language pretends to make things present to us but always fails to do so is no news to poets. Yes, writing does distort presence. Yes, there's an abyss between the words and the experience of presence the poem is trying to name. Yet we still have a pretty good idea what Sappho and Akhmatova are saying. In the moment of time when the small drop forms but does not fall, says Theodore Roethke. American poetry has been obsessed with presence and visible truth since the days of Emerson and Whitman. By visible truth we mean the apprehension of the absolute condition of present things, writes Melville to Hawthorne in a letter. The subject of much American poetry is the epistemology of presence. Frost, Stevens, and Williams all have something to say about that. John Ashbery's magnificent poem Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror is a meditation on that enigma. That stranger, as he calls it, the mute, undivided present. To unlock the instant, to penetrate its astonished rooms, again, pause. Here's a point at which time and eternity, history and consciousness meet. A fragment of time haunted by the whole of time. The present is the only place where we experience the eternal. The eternal shrinks to the size of the present because only the present can be humanly grasped. In its essence, a lyric poem is about time stopped. Language moves in time, but the lyric impulse is vertical. Of course, one can't really say what presence is. One can only attempt to say what it is like. Sometimes, and this is a paradox, only wildest imaginings can bridge the abyss of word and thing. Poetry thrives on such contradictions. One is both using language and being used by language, for instance. I love Sappho's sense of the moment, but I also have Homer's one-eyed giants, many-headed monsters, not to mention those women who are half fish and who sing so beautifully that sailors have to stick wax in their ears or they go nuts, plus all his other wonderful inventions. The best thing about poetry is that it greatly upsets schoolmasters, preachers, and dictators, and cheers up the rest of us.